The show continues. Oh, good. I was hoping we had our banner up. And we have our star couple in the center of the front row. Sylvia and Eddie. Yes, we do. And Wilson Excellence continues to be on display. I want to recognize some people that I failed to recognize at lunch. Here we go again. Our former board chair, Joe Gildenhorn and Alma Gildenhorn, were just here. They may still be in the lobby, but he chaired our board so excellently for 11 years. Our current board chair, Tom Nides, was here by phone, not able to join us today, but we had numbers of board members in attendance this morning. We still have the Hardy board members. They include Peter Bashar, Thelma Duggan. Thelma, did I find you? Are you still here? I hope so. She's coming. Susan Helms, Natalie Reyes, Earl Stafford, and Jane Stetson, Christine Kalki, Jane McAuliffe, and Maureen McLaughlin. Some of these are White House appointed private board members, and some are public board members, and we are enormously grateful for your service. We also have many members of our cabinet, and we have many members of Brown Capital Management in the front row, and I want to take a minute to recognize a guy that I'm delighted to see, and his name is Steve McDonald, and he's the guy in the back, looks like Santa Claus. There he is. He used to play Santa Claus at all our, I don't want to disillusion any of the kids in the audience, but actually he was Santa Claus at all our holiday parties. But Steve was the longtime director of our Africa program, has been through a lot of health issues. He's a sleeker, leaner version of his former self, and we're absolutely delighted to see you here. So we have two dear friends of the Wilson Center to thank for today's panel, Eddie and Sylvia Brown. They've given Washington a very brainy gift, the Brown Capital Management Forum, which we launch here today, and which we actually launched at lunch that many of you attended just an hour ago. My thanks to them and all of today's speakers for their commitment to the issues we will be discussing here. The forum will be an exceptional platform for business, political, and scholarly leaders, for the people who care, as we do, about strong economic ties between Africa and the United States. And to mark that commitment, in addition to the conversation we had at lunch, we've gathered an all-star panel to discuss the progress made in the past year since the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit. You'll hear first from the current director of our Africa program, Dr. Monde Myangwa, a Rhodes Scholar. She was recently on the U.S. delegation that accompanied President Obama on his trip to Africa. Her list of admirers in the policy community grows day by day. Also like to welcome the talented lineup joining our panel today: GE Africa's Jay Ireland, Covington and Burling's Dr. Whitney Schneidman, Solomon Asamoah, who is Vice President of the African Development Bank, and Ambassador Richard Sezibera, Secretary General of the East Africa Community. My thanks to all of you. As I mentioned at lunch, we were hoping that a keynote set of comments would have been offered by Congressmember Karen Bass of California, a dear friend of mine. We served together in the House, but she also was the first Speaker of the California Assembly, who happens to be an African-American woman. And she's a path breaker, and she, in my view, in my nonpartisan view, will someday be Speaker of the House of Representatives. But at any rate, she cannot join us because the House is debating the Iran deal, and there is a series of votes, and we tried every way we could to find 5 minutes for her to come down here before lunch, during lunch, after lunch, before this panel, during this panel, after this panel, and I have nothing to do with scheduling the House, and I'm delighted that I serve here at this time and can be here, and I just want to say with great pride that our Africa program, Steve, remains alive and well, and that it is my delight to introduce and welcome Monde Myangwa.
Congresswoman Harman, thank you so much for that very kind introduction and for the excellent remarks setting the stage for our discussion this afternoon. Congresswoman Harman has already talked about what the Brown Capital Management Africa Forum is all about. But I want to spend a moment sort of situating why this day is really important to us and why we're so grateful to Mr. and Mrs. Brown, cabinet members of the Wilson Center, and to the Brown Capital Management team for being so generous with their funding to help us establish this forum. As many of you know, for too long, U.S. Africa relations were defined by Cold War calculations, humanitarian crises, and conflict and insecurity, while economic and development matters were largely on the periphery of U.S. engagement with the continent. Under the Clinton and Bush administrations, development and economic engagement slowly began to take shape, but it was not until last year's historic U.S. Africa Leaders Summit, anchored by the U.S. Africa Business Forum, that President Obama tried to reposition U.S. Africa relations by bringing economic and business issues squarely into the center of the U.S. Africa relationship. The Obama administration's focus on the transformative issues of entrepreneurship, youth leadership, and the crucial role of the private sector in Africa illustrate this repositioning. And during that summit, as you will hear from some of our speakers, many commitments were made across the governance, security, and economic realms, but most of the commitments were in the economic and business sphere, including more than $33 billion in trade and investment deals. So the launch of Brown Capital Forum comes almost exactly a year after the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit and provides the perfect opportunity to look back at that historic summit, to evaluate progress, and to also look at the challenges, honestly and squarely, that have been faced in delivering on some of those commitments. More importantly, what we hope to do today and over the course of this 5-year partnership is to offer practical recommendations, steps, and options from both the African and American perspectives for consolidating, expanding mutually beneficial economic relations between the United States and Africa. And I emphasize the mutually beneficial. It is important that both Africa and the United States see some gain that they're gaining from any sort of business engagement, commercial engagement, economic relationship that we will have going forward. It is also important that trade and investment be used to support sustainable development in Africa. Without that, it is just trade and investment, and we're talking largely just about the numbers and not the impact on the quality of life that trade and investment has on the ordinary African citizens across the continent. And so we're really grateful for this gift that allows us to delve deeply and look at what sort of relationship would we like to see between Africa and the United States in the economic sphere, to talk about what are some of the changes that African governments need to make, what are some of the changes that the U.S. government also needs to make and U.S. companies need to make in order to fully benefit from this relationship. To help us launch this discussion, it is now my pleasure to introduce the knowledgeable and accomplished speakers that we have assembled here today as we launch this very important forum, looking at the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit 1 year on, progress, challenges, and the way forward for economic relations. We have senior American and African leaders, including policymakers as well as practitioners. And our goal here is to have a real dialogue, an honest-to-goodness dialogue. We've asked the speakers not to shy away from the real issues, to speak directly to the challenges, even while we acknowledge the progress that has been made. So let me very quickly introduce the speaker in the order in which they will speak. Our first speaker will be Dr. Whitney Schneidman, who is a senior international advisor at Covington and Burling and a fellow at Brookings. But for us, and we're really proud of him, a member of the Advisory Council of the Africa Program here at the Wilson Center. He is also a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs. As a scholar, he provides insight and analysis into the major challenges and opportunities across the continent that is critical for companies' success in Africa. His work focuses on U.S.-Africa relations, trade and investment, and regional integration on the continent. And to help situate our discussion today, we have asked Dr. Schneidman to offer his assessment on the progress as well as the key challenges in implementing the commitments made, to speak also to the role of small and medium-sized enterprises in U.S.-Africa trade and investment, and to offer some practical recommendations for the way forward. Our next speaker will be Mr. Jay Ireland, who is the President and CEO of U.S Africa and also a member of President Obama's Advisory Council on Doing Business in Africa. In his capacity as CEO of GE Africa, he is responsible for GE's operations in Africa, including power generation, healthcare, transportation, oil and gas, and aviation. He's also active in organizations working on the continent, including as co-chair of the World Economic Forum Strategic Infrastructure Initiative in Africa and a board member of the Global Alliance for Clean Cook Stoves. We have asked him to speak about the mission, work, and accomplishments of the President's Council on Doing Business in Africa, and also to offer his perspectives on the practicalities of doing business on the ground in Africa as part of GE's team. He too has been asked to speak very directly to some of the challenges that he sees ahead, both from a US perspective, but also from an African perspective, and to offer recommendations for the way forward. Then our third speaker will be Ambassador Donald Gibbs, who is a senior counselor with the Albright Stonebridge Group and a very good friend and supporter of the Africa program. He also serves as chair of the U.S. Africa Business Council, and he has served as United States Ambassador to South Africa from 2009 until 2013, when he was recognized for his efforts to promote improved relations with South Africa and was a recipient of the 2010 Suam Cobb Award for Exemplary Diplomatic Service. Prior to that, Ambassador Gibbs served as assistant to President Obama, and he was leader of the presidential transition team and then served in the White House, where he ran the Office of Presidential Personnel. We have asked Ambassador Gibbs to give us a summary of the key points from the discussion that he just had with Mr. Selig and offer his own perspectives on the recently renewed AGOA and what we should be thinking about now in terms of beyond AGOA. It is very important, as I mentioned earlier, that this be a dialogue. So we have brought two senior Africans to give African perspectives on some of the issues that we will be discussing as part of this forum. Ambassador Richard Sezibera is the Secretary General of the East African Community, an intergovernmental organization that brings together Burundi, Kenya, Rwanda, Tanzania, and Uganda, and is noted for its success in economic integration. And prior to his leadership of the EAC, Ambassador Sezibera served in several capacities in the Rwandan government. Absolutely delighted to have you here. I know you had to make last-minute travel changes, and we appreciate you making those changes to join us here today. Our final speaker, but certainly not the least, will be Mr. Solomon Asamoah, who is Vice President for Infrastructure, Private Sector, and Regional Integration at the African Development Bank. He's responsible for the bank's private sector operations, regional projects, and the implementation of sustainable infrastructure programs throughout Africa. He's an experienced investment professional who has worked in developing and developed markets for more than 25 years, including serving as the Deputy CEO and Chief Investment Officer for the African Finance Corporation. And we have asked Mr. Asamoah to offer his perspective on progress and to highlight key issues that hinder trade and investment in Africa, as well as the top obstacles to U.S. Africa economic relations. Before you all get started, I know it's a very, it's not a gender-balanced panel. And so I will offer my apologies right away. We did try and get some women on the panel. Unfortunately, both of the women that we had on the panel had to cancel at the very last minute due to other pressing commitments. So I'll try my best to represent the other side, but I'll count on all of you also to engage. And with that, let me invite Whitney to give us an overview of last year's U.S. Africa Leaders Summit and the key commitments that came out of that, as well as your recommendations.
Great. Thank you very much, Amanda. And just let me congratulate you. I think it's been about a year since you've been the leader of this program. And this program was started by Congressman Howard Wolpe, who was chair of the African Subcommittee, a dear friend. You heard Jane Harmon extol Steve McDonald. So just congratulations to you and your leadership, which is totally consistent with theirs. And to the Brown family, thank you so much for your commitment as a part-time contributor and a constant consumer of what comes out of here. It's very much appreciated. So just let me touch on some of the highlights. Last year, as I'm sure many are aware, President Obama invited more than, I think, about 51 heads of state to the United States for the first ever White House summit. For those of us who have been laboring in this vineyard for some time, that was a transformational event. It was transformational in this way. For so long, our relationship to Africa has really, to be honest, been focused on who we like, who are the good guys, who are the ones that are making the most progress. And where there are really tough issues and where there are governments who represent really tough problems, we sort of didn't get involved with that. But when you invite 51 heads of government into your house, that signals that we're prepared to deal with everybody on their terms and our terms. And it means that we're going to have very candid conversations on the issues where we agree, trade and investment, the issues where we need to cooperate, security, and the issues where we disagree, governance, transparency, human rights. And that is really the opening of a new era, I think, in the U.S. African relationship, and it's the great accomplishment of this summit. And it really laid the groundwork for the president's visit to Kenya and then on to Ethiopia, both extremely important countries, but ones that had never been visited by a U.S. president. When you look at where U.S. presidents have gone in the past, starting principally from Clinton and then President Bush and then first term President Obama, you know, there's a lot of visits to Senegal, a lot of visits to Ghana, a lot of visits to South Africa, and it trails off after this. So I think, you know, we're in a new era here, having gone to Kenya, having gone to Ethiopia. Hopefully before the president leaves, there'll be more trips to a French-speaking country, to a Portuguese-speaking country. President, I argue, has to go to Nigeria. So that's one significant outcome. The other is the movement of trade and investment to the forefront of the U.S. Africa agenda. And this didn't happen overnight. The process started in 2000, I think it can be argued, when a strong bipartisan consensus in the Congress passed the African Growth and Opportunity Act. That same bipartisan consensus supported the creation of the Millennium Challenge Corporation in the Bush administration, and it's continued to this day to the reauthorization of AGOA. And I think President Obama understood that the tide was changing, that when you went to African ministers, when you went to African heads of state, you went to African leaders from all sectors, they didn't want aid, they don't want aid. They want trade and investment, they want jobs, they want technologies, they want opportunities. And increasingly, U.S. policy is responding. And President Obama sort of, I think, really pushed the agenda forward when he was in Tanzania in 2013 and held the first Africa Business Leaders Forum, where he met with 22 CEOs. I believe Jay was there for that. And then last year, the U.S. Africa Business Forum, which was really quite an extraordinary event where President Obama participated the whole day. This year he was in Nairobi for the Global Entrepreneurship Summit that Monday was at and Don was at. I think a number of us were there. Solomon was there. I was there. And that was all about dealing with entrepreneurs, small and medium businesses. And then he said that he will hold another U.S. Africa Business Forum next year. So that will be 4 major business events in 4 years that the president has participated. And that's really quite significant. So those are the 2 broad highlights. I think when we drill down into, you know, promises made, promises kept, I think it looks pretty good. Reference was made to AGOA. This has been a priority for the administration to get AGOA extended in a seamless fashion, to have it extended for 10 years as it was in May and June. That says that there's predictability and stability in the U.S.-African economic relationship. To many, Africa is seen as a continent of uncertainty. To have this policy stability in place for 10 years helps to respond to that perception in a very positive way. At the summit last year, the administration called for AGOA to be expanded to include more products, to improve rules of origin, to update the eligibility criteria. And by and large, that process, those goals were achieved. Because it used to be that if there was a coup or a faulty election, that government could get kicked out of AGOA. Now there's a process that takes a more nurtured, a more sequenced look at that that doesn't necessarily blame the workers who are making the products, but can focus more on the governments, the governors who cause the problems. Another outcome, which I think Jay will talk about, was the doing business in Africa. President Obama directed the Secretary of Commerce to create a commission to look at how we can do business in Africa more quickly. And this committee came out with a report in 9 months. I've served on 2 advisory committees in Washington, and I can tell you 9 months for a report that's a really interesting report to read is sort of unheard of. And they've done a really good job, and they've created a new voice for advocacy for U.S. Business. One recommendation that they made that caught my attention was the need for the U.S. to create a U.S. Africa Infrastructure Center. And increasingly, I think we're in a position to do that. And infrastructure plays such an important role. It's not just the roads and the dams that are needed and that U.S. companies need to be part of it, but it's virtually in every sector, communications technology, healthcare, that infrastructure needs need to be addressed, and U.S. companies should be at the forefront of this. Another thing that the administration committed to was expanding the presence of the U.S. government to help U.S. business be successful. And over the last year, the Commerce Department has really ramped up its presence, opening new offices in Angola, Tanzania, Ethiopia, and Mozambique. And USAID as well has refashioned the commercial hubs, used to be called the trade hubs in Ghana, Kenya, and South Africa. And they were designed to help African companies benefit from AGOA. Now they're trade and investment hubs to help U.S. companies also take advantage of the opportunities. But I think this puts an onus on the administration to make sure that there's close collaboration and clear lines of operation between what Commerce is doing and what USAID is doing. Similarly, there was some $14 billion of commitments that were made by the private sector last year. We need to keep track of those commitments. And I think the Commerce Department has a role on the Doing Business in Africa website to keep track, to show the broad public, what investments are actually being followed up on. And it's not just the investments, but it's the jobs that are being created. It's the small and medium enterprises that are being supported. It's the women who are being brought into the formal sector. We need to know that information because that's such an important part to the follow-through of these commitments. Let me just make one last point about Power Africa, which is really a flagship initiative of this administration. Power Africa was tripled in its scope at last year's summit, and it's now focused on extending electricity to 60 million businesses and households across the continent, which is an incredibly important objective. The problem that we're facing is one of managing expectations. And here, too, I think the administration needs to do a better job. Because when you look at Power Africa closely, they're focused on developing projects and coming to financial close. The broader public is waiting for the switch to be flipped. And there's about a 7 to 10 year gap in that process. So I think we need to really be careful about making sure that expectations are aligned and that real information is being conveyed about how progress is being made toward those goals. So just to sum up, going forward over the next year, I think that the business forum that the president's going to convene next year, hopefully that can happen in the same week as the AGOA forum, so we can really align our trade and investment strategies. There's been a suggestion that the White House creates a position for a White House policy coordinator of our economic and commercial policy in Africa, and I think that would help a lot to bring coherence. Tracking the deals are quite important. And finally, let's advocate for another visit to Africa by the president before he leaves office. So let me stop there and pass it back to you.
Thank you, Whitney. Mr. Ireland, over to you. Tell us a little bit about the President's
Sure.
business.
Thanks, and again, thank you, Mr. and Mrs. Brown, for this opportunity in the Wilson Center. All protocols observed, as we say in Africa.
Thank you. Yes.
And you know, GE, I worked for GE, and about 5 years ago, our board of directors and CEO wanted to put a lot more emphasis on developing markets. So they put some senior leaders in some of the markets. I went to Africa. I live in Nairobi, Kenya. I've been there for 4.5 years. And I think one of the things, when you talk about President Obama's initiative, Power Africa, et cetera, I got there in early 2011. And at that time, we set up our regional headquarters, our Sub-Saharan Africa headquarters in Nairobi. And there was really not a lot of, I would say, there was government help with the embassies and what they were doing. Don and I became well acquainted around a big rail order in South Africa. And, but there wasn't a concerted effort. And what we saw over time was our competitors, not our traditional competitors, Siemens, Philips, Caterpillar, et cetera, but other competitors, countries, China, Turkey, India, come over from the standpoint of bringing all the resources they could, government as well as private sector. So over the years, and providing solutions. The businesses that we're in and infrastructures you heard earlier are big ticket items that require a solution, not just selling the product, financing the product, potentially tying in regulations, working through the regulations for power, distribution, et cetera. So it was subsequently we did meet with the president on his 2013 trip in Tanzania, and he toured a physical plant that a power plant that we are supplying in Tanzania. And one of the things we talked about was a little bit of that aspect from a competitive standpoint. And I think that's where some of the genesis of some of the ideas came from for this doing business in Africa, the summit that occurred in 2014. And so it was very helpful from that standpoint. And I think some of the things from the PAC DBIA, as they call it, is really a standpoint of driving what can help American businesses do more business in Africa. And there are a lot of policy things, obviously, but more importantly, it's helping businesses understand what they need to do. And number one thing that they need to do, which I tell everybody, is you can't do it sitting over here. And too many times, there's too many people still in companies that have their African headquarters in London or Dubai or wherever, and they say, oh, well, it's just as easy to fly. I can get to every African country from London or Dubai or Paris or wherever. But the problem is you're not there. You're not living the issues. You're not really understanding the issues, and you're not there and more immediately when you need to be there, when you get called by government, or customers. So I think that's number one. Number two is we need to provide the ability for especially small and medium enterprises to really understand how they can do business. There's a lot of interest, and there's a lot of capability that can be brought. I think we need, as a large multinational, we're tasked, I think, with the responsibility of trying to build out a supply chain in Africa. So we're putting in $800 million in facilities, manufacturing facilities, as well as innovation and engineering facilities. And tied into that is skills building, as well as building out our supply chain through some novel financial ideas, and as well as some of the engineering and STEM things that we need to do. And so that is a key thing. And I think, again, that's where we need to think about a broader base of approach. So the Young African Leaders Initiative is another key thing that's been helpful. But quite frankly, I'm not going to run through the PAC DBIA recommendations. You know, those cold chain approvals in agriculture, the infrastructure center, which Whitney talked about, a number of other things. But the key thing that we need to understand is we need to, if we want the American companies / government to make an impact, we need to work from a standpoint of consolidating our strength, if you will. So when people talk about somebody asked earlier in the lunch about China companies. No one thinks about the Chinese as companies. They think about it as China. They think about American companies, and that's kind of the history we've had. But in reality, we have a lot of effort that's being done by the U.S. government that is actually very fragmented, and people don't really understand what's going on. You know, we've had PEPFAR, we've had MCC, a lot of the stuff you mentioned, but again, that all falls down through, rather than one big influence. And we hope through this President's Council that we can at least corral some of the things from at least a business perspective to really kind of drive through that. Part of that, not to get overly political here, but the Exim Bank is a big thing. And quite frankly, when you're in Africa and you're visiting a head of state or ministers, and you're talking about a power plant, an airplane deal, healthcare facilities, they want Exim financing. And the reason they do is that they want, it's a imprimatur on that country from America. It's the only way the United States can invest in their country is through the Exim Bank. And that's how they look at it. There's a stamp of approval of their government, their country from the United States. Yes, it's subsidized financing, but they can get subsidized financing from anywhere. As you heard earlier, there's 60 ECAs out there. So I think we're missing the discussion on what really is the impact, which is around, I call it economic diplomacy. And it's not like, again, the corporate welfare and all that. We get asked, we want, you know, we need to get it financed, the leaders, and they go, we'd like the, you know, the U.S. Exim Bank. So I think that's something that's another piece of a toolkit that is very important for doing business in Africa. And I think the last thing I'll comment on is the infrastructure aspect. If we don't help and drive the infrastructure, and it's not just, as you heard, roads and power and et cetera, but it's healthcare, it's agriculture, it's all of the capability that Africa has will not come to fruition unless we really make an impact on this. You know, Don said earlier that there are more babies born in Nigeria than Europe in this year. Unfortunately, 250,000 of those babies born will die in the first 28 days because of neonatal care and stuff. This is the kind of stuff that has to get fixed. And I think from that aspect, it's a combination of healthcare. You need healthy population. We need to invest in the education, which is also infrastructure. We need logistics capability, and we need power. And that's going to be a key thing. And I'm sure Richard will talk about the inter-Africa trade. That's key for regional aspects as well. So I think overall, it's an unbelievably exciting place to do business. I'm very much of a pragmatist. We do have a lot of issues that you deal with. I feel that I'm an optimistic pragmatist. So I'm 2 steps forward, 1 step back. You go through a lot of the issues, but you continue to make progress. And so we're very happy. We've continued to invest. As I said, we're putting in almost $1 billion. We've quadrupled our employment base. We have 90+% of our employees are Africans, and 70% of my leadership team is African. And so we feel that you have to be there, and you have to be there with the people, and the people that are going to sustain this over a long period of time. So,
Thank you. Ambassador Gibbs, the floor is yours.
Thank you. First of all, Monday, thank you to you and the Browns, and to repeat, Jay, all protocols observed. It was my favorite expression as ambassador because I didn't have to pronounce people's names, which I was always afraid of. You know, I think both Jay and Whitney hit on the incredible scope of the programs that the administration has launched. When I took over as ambassador, I'll never forget, I was at a reception, it might have even been here at the Wilson Center, I was back in the States, and a woman came up to me and said, you know, I'm doing this big fund in South Africa that OPIC, a US government agency, is supporting me. And I said, really? And she said, yeah. And I said, how come I don't know about it? I was the ambassador. It was a $500 million investment by the US in a fund, building housing in South Africa, that as ambassador I didn't know about. It showed how disorganized we were at the beginning of the administration. And I think the efforts that both Jay and Whitney talked about to try and consolidate that. No one ever would have designed our sort of trade promotion the way we've designed it. It's an accident of history that we have so many different agencies doing pieces of this, but at least there's now a concerted effort to bring that together, coordinate, and I think the PAC-DBI effort is very important for driving that. I also think that the Heads of State Summit really was probably the most pivotal moment for bringing our relationship to a new level and changing the tenor. And probably, to me and to the people I work with, the most important part of that was not that all the heads of state were there, but it was all the African business leaders who were in the room, got to meet American business leaders. And for a number of companies that I talked to, they came away saying, wow, there's somebody just as smart as I am who understands this market that I can partner with and that I can work with going into Africa. So whether it was Aliko Dangote or Strive Masiwa or whoever was on the stage, American business got to see a very different face of Africa and one that they could relate to and partner with in a way that I don't think had happened before. Undersecretary Selig and I touched on a bunch of things during his lunch conversation, including the renewal of GOA, which was a huge effort by Congress this year. It's been renewed for 10 years. So, and Monday keeps asking the question, what comes next? I think it's a really important question. I'm going to let my colleague from the EAC talk a little bit about this. But I think the next stage of AGOA has to be about breaking down the barriers between doing trade within Africa. When I look at 49 or 54, depending on how you want to count countries in Africa, none of those market sizes by themselves are big enough to support the manufacturing base. Jay can't put 54 factories in Africa. Africa needs of the same kind, right? Yet localization laws are asking him to build in each place. It won't work. It's incredibly difficult, both from flight perspective, visa perspective, rules to go from one African country to another. Many of my friends who do work in West Africa fly through France to get to Nigeria. These things have to change if Africa is going to realize its potential. And I think that's where there's a chance for a real partnership to work. Undersecretary Selig also quoted Rahm Emanuel. We were talking a little bit about what's facing Africa, and there's some bad winds headed towards Africa right now. The turn down in China, the fact that we may raise our interest rates, the fall in oil prices, and the changes around commodities mean some countries, not all, but some are going to be challenged by the next period that's coming up. Hopefully that challenge will lead to reforms that make it even easier for partnership, for business to come in and invest and help them grow out those economies. And I think that'll be one of the big tests as we go forward over the next 5 years.
Thank you. Ambassador Sesebera.
Well, thank you very much first of all, for inviting me, and thank you, the Brown family, for providing this forum. Now, this is extremely exciting for me because in 1999, 2000, I was here in Washington as ambassador. I see Ambassador Mombuli here, and he knows what I'm talking about. At that time, we tried to organize a forum around Africa with some of our friends to talk about business. We didn't go very far. We managed to get a few people who were interested in HIV/AIDS, and we eventually formed a group around to lobby for PEPFAR. We did manage to find a group around AGOA, but it was very difficult to talk about business, U.S. Africa business, and so I'm extremely excited to be here. Come back this year, 2015, in addition to all the things we have talked about, Walt and others, I visit Kansas and I find Rwandan coffee on supermarkets in Kansas City. So it's been a tremendous journey, and I don't think we celebrate this transformation enough between the US and Africa. I come from East Africa, 5 countries, 140 million people collectively. Now every time we come to the United States, some people ask us, they say from Africa, they don't understand Rwanda or Tanzania or Kenya, whatever it is. And then the ambassadors here keep trying to explain that Africa is not a country, but a continent. Some of us are now involved in trying to make sure that Africa is a country. So the East African community is about getting these 5 countries together with the ultimate aim of having a political federation for East Africa. We now have a customs union, so we are the single customs territory. We have formed a common market. And in 2013, we agreed on a monetary union with a 10-year roadmap to a single currency for these 5 countries. So it's an exciting period for us. We are trying to create a single market. And then we are moving with our colleagues in other regional blocks in South, SADC, and in COMESA to form what we call a tripartite free trade area. This will have 600 million people, GDP over $1.2 trillion. So Africa is doing the right things. We're investing in infrastructure, including energy. We are investing in removing barriers to trade. There are still some issues, but I think we've gone a long way. And most importantly, we are making sure that intra-African trade rises. In East Africa, it is risen from less than 10% over 10 years ago to over 26%. And we want it to be over 40%, because if Africans cannot trade among themselves, why should we be asking you to come and trade with us? So that's, we're trying to form this market for ourselves as Africans, and then asking others who can come to join us to do so. We, in this trade agenda, have agreed with the United States we have a number of agreements we've held. We have now a facilitation agreement between East Africa and the US. We have a commercial dialogue between East African community countries and businesses and the US business, with a roadmap and practical issues that we are working on. And we will be negotiating a regional investment treaty with the United States. I say this because I think this is where the relationship between Africa and the US needs to be. Yes, thank you very much for AGOA, 10-year extension. We asked for that, and I'm glad that our colleagues delivered, and we thank you. But beyond AGOA, we will have to have an economic relationship with the United States that is anchored in more than just quota-free, duty-free access for by African goods to the US market. That is anchored in more than just that. That's a real partnership. AGOA now is a unilateral initiative. We have very little to say about when and how it gets renewed. And I don't think you can have a relationship for the long term based on a unilateral initiative. So we have to think through this period, the next 10 years, what relationship the US and Africa can have that's based on an agreement that's negotiated between the two parties. I think as far as US businesses are concerned, Africa is open for business. I'm glad that Jay is here. He's putting in the millions of dollars he said. When I talk, we just have completed an East African manufacturing conference in Uganda. And I was extremely gratified to hear that companies are making these big investments. The Coca-Colas are putting in over $1.2 billion. The Nestles of the world are in there. But most importantly, local entrepreneurs are growing their businesses very fast. They are billion-dollar businesses. In fact, one of our manufacturers was telling me that his biggest fear in the next 10 years is that he fails to grow his business by $2.5 billion. That is the biggest fear he has. So there is a lot of optimism. There are lots of opportunities. And I think there is a field that's open for U.S. business to come in. What we need to do is to, on both sides, make sure that we break this barrier, which I think is a mental barrier, between U.S. businesses and Africa. One simple example, conflict. Africa is by and large stable and secure. But even if it were not, I was taking an inventory at the number of U.S. companies investing in Israel. And there are not many more than those that invest on the entire African continent. And of course, if you want to live in a difficult environment, you go to Israel. But American companies are there. And therefore, I think we need to find a way of breaking this barrier. And the only way to break it is to get as many companies as possible to come and set up shop in Africa. Jay, you need to convince your colleagues to come and join you and tell them you are making money. So I think as far as we are on our side, we will continue to do what we have to do to make sure that Africa is safe, stable, secure, healthy, educated, because that's what we want for our people. Let me conclude where you commented on, Dr. Monde, about women. You see, Africa now has about 700 million women and growing. They'll be females. They'll be over 1.4 million in the next billion in the next few years. I am surprised that nobody has set up a sizable manufacturing facility for contraceptives in Africa. I don't know where they're setting up these companies from, but this is a missed opportunity. If I was in business, that's... So you can, for any field you choose on our continent, you can look at something as a challenge or an opportunity. Be it energy, be it infrastructure, be it fertility, whatever it is. And this is the time to come and make those investments that will accompany us to our prosperity. Thank you very much.
Mr. Samoa, close us off on the presentations, please.
Okay, thank you very much. And let me also add my thanks to the organizers and the Brown family for giving us this opportunity in this platform. My name is Solomon Asamoah. I'm the Vice President at the African Development Bank, responsible for infrastructure, private sector, and regional integration. But let me first boast of my DC ties, as you mentioned. I lived here for 10 years. My children were born in DC when I used to work at IFC. And let me start off by the issue that I think sometimes get lost when we talk about U.S. Africa relations. For me, it's always been, I'm from Ghana, it's always been a mystery to me why the U.S. is not more involved on the economic side in Africa, given three factors. Number one, U.S. doesn't have the historical colonial baggage that some of the other countries have in Africa, which I think is positive. Secondly, I think the number of Africans who have relatives in the U.S. and who are doing well as Africans in the U.S. is very high, who feed back positive stories about the U.S. Means again there's a natural affinity there that can be further exploited. And then thirdly, obviously, the African-American ties to Africa is something which I think can also be further exploited and leveraged. So for these reasons, I think the US has a huge opportunity, even bigger than's been taken so far, to cement and do further things in Africa. But I just wanted to start with that. I'll talk a little bit about the state of Africa as it stands at the moment, with some issues and some opportunities. And I've also been asked to touch a little bit on the private equity industry as well, and the importance of that. First off, the African Development Bank, for those of you who don't know, is a development agency that covers Africa, that has every African country as a shareholder, and then also some non-African countries as shareholders, including the US as well. So it has an access and a presence across Africa which is unrivaled by many other institutions. We also, as well as doing investments, we also do advocacy. We also argue for policies which will bring development towards Africa. And we're generally seen as a neutral party. We don't really have a political agenda. Our agenda is really developmental. And so we see ourselves as a natural partner for US companies who want to explore and work with a trusted partner across Africa. We recently had a new president of the African Development Bank last week elected. He started. And he outlined 5 major priorities for the bank, for himself and for the bank. Africa should be striving to power itself. It should be striving to feed itself. It should be striving to integrate itself. And it should be striving to industrialize. And then finally, to improve the quality of its people's lives. So those are the 5 major things that are going to drive his vision and the vision of our institution. In terms of the general status of investment and economic activity in Africa, I think there's some very good signs and there's some challenges. I'll touch upon both because I believe in having a balanced and a realistic and a frank dialogue. On the good side, some of these have been mentioned already. It's a high growth region, second fastest behind parts of Asia growth region in the world, at approximately double the world average of growth. But there are also other signs of Africa moving forward, because as this person on the ground said one time, GDP number growth rates are great, but you can't eat GDP numbers. So behind those numbers, there's also some interesting facts as well. Foreign direct investment flows in 2014 rose for the 3rd year in a row to over $60 billion into Africa. And what's also interesting is that remittances, money sent by Africans in the diaspora back to Africa, surpassed both foreign direct investment and official development agency flows. So Africans themselves sending money back into the continent is a higher value. And I always believe that, investing in some way is always easier when people from that place are also investing. Yeah. Gives you comfort, and it shows there's real opportunities there. The growing middle class, it was mentioned during lunch, is a very real phenomenon. And the interesting thing about the middle class in Africa is it has proven and growing purchasing power, and they're very discerning consumers there. And if you produce the quality products and the services, there's a capacity and a willingness to pay that people sometimes overlook. There's a lot of wealth, there's a lot of money in Africa. It doesn't always show itself in the official figures. But if you provide the right business products, you can usually find a market for it. I think the biggest one that everybody talks about was the mobile telephone market a decade or so ago. Before that started, a lot of people said, nah, mobile phones, they were yuppie things, they were for rich people, etc. Would never take off in Africa. Africa was the fastest growing and remains one of the largest, most dynamic markets for mobile phones, and in many cases leads the world, because the jump in technology now, digital payments, banking, savings, credit, insurance, all of these things, people are using their mobile phones in a way that you don't even use them yet in the US. It's a major opportunity. And just on the issue of gender, it's very interesting that Africa is the only region where more females have mobile phones than males, which is incredible. So if you think about, and also as well, if you also think about the young people and the smartphones now, and the content and the information and the entertainment that's being transmitted, it's a huge potential business opportunity just waiting to happen. And as we put the basic infrastructure in place, the internet penetration is going to skyrocket up as well. So it's going to be a very interesting time on that side of things. The demographic dividend, the fact that Africa has a young and growing population. Africa's 1 billion is expected to turn into about 1.6 billion by 2060, and 50% under the age of 17. I heard an interesting point the other day. I don't know if it's true, so don't quote me. But I heard that by, I think it's by 2050, more than half of the young people in the world will be in Africa. So if you're a global company with ambitions, can you really be a global company without an Africa strategy? And maybe now is the time that you should be positioning yourself. It won't be easy, there'll be bumps and roads, but if you position yourself now, you can see where the future is going. I spent some time recently in Japan, where it's an aging population, and they're asking themselves, where is the growth going to come from? You see the same kind of dynamics in Europe. This continent, Africa, is where a lot of it is going to come from. I think the other thing as well that we have is that we have a real acceptance by governments beyond just rhetoric of the private sector. And they need the private sector to invest more. And so what they need to do is they need to change a lot of their policies to be able to make it attractive. Now, beyond the rhetoric, we actually see some practical things that they're doing. And I think the biggest sign of this is that allowing commercial tariffs to be charged by private sector companies for the provision of services such as power and toll roads and things of that nature. So there's good returns to be made by the private sector when they invest across Africa. Growing regional integration, even the private equity funds industry. Between 2007 and 2014, $35 billion US was invested, and $22 billion have been raised since 2007 in Africa. And then somebody also mentioned the growth of local, strong, regional and economic companies who can be partners to overseas companies. And yet all of these good stories are happening in a region where there's a power deficit in every single country. Only 23% of adults have a banking account. Stock markets are very small, very liquid, poorly capitalized. So if Africa can grow at the rate it's growing in these circumstances, you can imagine what it's going to do when we start to fix some of these basic infrastructure gaps that we have. So moving on quickly to the challenges, closing this infrastructure gap. We need more local and international investments such as GE to help us address some of these infrastructure deficits. And it's starting to come. But the challenge that we have to overcome, I think principally, is we need greater consistency of government policies. There's nothing more off-putting to investors than a government that changes its mind, or when the minister changes, the policy changes, or when the government changes, the policy changes. So we ourselves as Africans need to have more consistent government policies. We also need to have greater capacity within our government departments that actually manage these investments. So that it's very good at the ministerial level, they're very, very strong, but when you actually go down to the civil service, a couple of levels, those are the people that investors have to deal with. You find that the capacity is very mixed. So we need to invest and strengthen our capacity within the civil servants. We need to also focus more on project development. Developing projects to the stage where they can be financed and become bankable is an area. And then the issue of inclusive growth is something that's a real ticking time bomb potentially for Africa if we don't address. The income inequalities are very, very high, and in many respects too high. So the issue of inclusive, making sure people don't get left behind, either young people or gender, or women getting left behind, is a very important fact that we have to take very, very seriously, because the political and the security instabilities are often rooted in people being excluded from the economy. And then we also need to talk about climate change and greening the economy. Africa is a country that is a continent that contributes least to the climate effects, but suffers the most from the negative effects. And again, there's an opportunity, there's a business opportunity for, again, Africa to leapfrog some of these technologies and have more environmentally friendly policies and investments. And then agriculture, the big one, that employs most people in Africa. It still lacks investment, it's still very manually intensive. And we need to find a way to move that forward, become more mechanized, and attract young people into the agriculture and agribusiness sectors. So in summary, there's huge opportunities, there's huge progress, but there's many areas that we also need, challenges that we need to overcome. But the good thing about it is those challenges are investment opportunities, and there's good returns to be made. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much to all of our speakers for some really key points and that we can follow up on and really delve deeply into. Looking at the clock, and I think I will forgo my time in terms of my moderated presentation, because I see we have a packed house and I believe we have an overflow room as well. Yes. So we want to give as much opportunity for as many of you to engage with our speakers and contribute to this dialogue. So, but before I get started, just very quickly, let me talk about the rules for engagement in terms of how we proceed in the Q&A. As I said, you know, we have this room and possibly another 2 rooms out there. So what I'm going to ask you is, if you put your hand up, we'll bring a mic to you. Please identify yourself, the organization that you're affiliated with, and the speaker to whom you're directing the question. That would be 1 question. And please, if you can get to it in under a minute so we can get as many people as possible to participate in this dialogue. And with that, the floor is open. I'll take 3 questions at a time. We'll start with the lady right there and come to the gentleman next to her, or 2 down from her, and then the gentleman in the back.
My name's Yep Tren. I just want to ask you, Mr. Asamoah, what are the prospects for renewable energy, particularly solar power, that will benefit Africa?
Okay, thank you. Would you pass the mic to Ni?
Thank you. My name is Ni Akwete, and I'm with the African Immigrants Caucus. I'd like any person on the panel to talk about the role of democracy and good governance, because it seems to me that in areas that we see conflict, a lot of it are based on people feeling excluded, and when you have instability, you are not going to have development. So I was wondering what balance any person sees where democracy should play a role in all this investment and trade in Africa. Thank you.
All right. And Malik in the back there.
Rick Blake, Strategic Health Resources. Mr. Ireland, this is Mr. Ireland. You talked about healthcare as one of a priority areas, one of the speakers. And we're a small consulting firm. We have some capability in Africa, and we've worked on some projects. My question to you is, since you invested $800 million or in the process of doing so, what realistic methodologies and pathways do you see for partnering with small businesses, particularly since we're in healthcare?
All right, I'll turn it over to the panel. Well, Solomon, I'll start with you and then just work around that way.
Okay, so renewable energy projects. I'm sure Jay will have a couple of things to say about that as well. But it's a huge opportunity for Africa. And specifically solar. I often make the joke that if the sun shone as much as it did Africa and probably any other developed parts of the world, they'd be driving solar as the main source of their power. So it's a huge opportunity waiting to happen. The technology has now advanced and caught up, so it's now become a lot more commercially attractive. I see a huge, but probably the biggest potential for solar I see is in off-grid solutions. So we focus a lot on, big power plants on grid, but rural areas, off-grid solutions are a huge opportunity waiting to happen. There's a company in Kenya called Copper, where they are basically for a relatively small amounts of money. They put a battery, a rechargeable battery, and something that goes on your roof. And then during the day, it charges up the battery. It means that you can have lights, a couple of light bulbs, and maybe a small fridge, maybe potentially. But the effect that that has in the rural areas, which allows children to read at night and changes the whole dynamic, is a real major impact. And Africa has an opportunity to leapfrog in that particular area. And then also on clean cooking solutions as well. More people in Africa die because of burning wood and charcoal and the smoke and the inhalation. We can find clean solutions for that using solar, I'm sure. But as I said, I'll defer to the expert, Jay, on these particular areas. But as an African Development Bank financier, these are areas that we're looking to do major things. Can I just quickly just touch on the democracy and governance issue that was raised? Okay. I think it's incredibly important. And what I like is what's been happening over the last, I'd say, 5 years or so, is that poor governance is now starting to be punished, both at the government level and also at the business level. And I think that's really the way to go. If you don't run your affairs, if you don't run your countries well, and I think the mobile phones have a lot to do with it, with the access to information and communication that's being transferred a lot. You'll find that there's a political price to pay as a government, and then as a business, if you ignore your community, there will be increasingly more prices to pay. So I think the democracy at the political level, but also corporate governance, is very, very important.
So on the renewable energy, I'll agree 100% with Solomon on the rural areas. It's a game changer to get those technologies. We've funded with the African Development Fund, an off-grid energy challenge where we've given out a couple $1 million of grants, $100,000 each, and probably half of those are solar and getting access to energy. On the big side of it, whether it's solar or wind, I mean, you've got some of the best wind regimes in the world in the Rift Valley in East Africa. And South Africa as well. There's been quite a bit of work done. Now, the real issue with renewables on a basic grid is the ability of the grid to have the fluctuations that occur. And so what happens is it's a combination of that and having a strong transmission and distribution system, which many countries do not have, and it needs to be invested in. Number two, quite frankly, is land issues, land rights. For the same reason people don't want stuff in their backyard here in the United States, it's the same in Africa. And we've put up wind farms in Kenya, and you've got to pay attention to the land rights and how you pay for the land, et cetera, and use the land and all that. So that's also another key piece of it as well. But it's going to be more, and I think one of the things that people do forget about renewables when they talk about Africa is hydro. If you look Kenya and geothermal, Kenya between geothermal, hydro, and wind, almost 70% of their power is renewable. And I think that's, and hydro can be a base load, as does geothermal, which doesn't have the fluctuations of wind and solar. Just a quick question on the healthcare, or a quick answer, I should say. For us, we look at anywhere, we do a lot of hospital development. Obviously, we sell equipment. We are investing in training facilities for radiologists, biomed techs, nurse anesthetists, whatever. You know what I'm talking about. I can't tell you how many times I've tried to say that word. The people that put you to sleep. And then across all of Africa, because that's a key thing. And if there's small companies, it's we try to be accessible. And I think, again, we talk about this infrastructure center and things like that from the President's Council. I think that'll be helpful in that as well.
Whitney, I think you had something to say or add to this discussion.
Just on the democracy
Yes.
point, because I think it's so important, and to follow up on what Solomon said, I think there's an organic relationship between economic development, economic opportunity, and governance. And I think if you look at the last 20, 25 years on the continent, there's been a dramatic improvement in both, not just in governance, but also in the role of civil society and in journalism and freedom of expression and accountability. And we don't recognize it enough. However, it's clearly, the story is not told. This is not finished yet. And being with President Obama in Kenya when I was there, I was just very struck by the candor with which he spoke to the Kenyan people when he said, Kenya last year lost 250,000 jobs because of corruption. 5 years ago, 10 years ago, that was a hard conversation to have. When he talks about tribalism and politics, that was a hard conversation to have 5 and 10 years ago. But it's a conversation that's being had now, and I think that's really part of the opportunity that we need to seize on, whether it's business, whether it's academics, whomever. But you just cannot emphasize enough the link between the need to improve governance and accountability and what that does for business opportunity.
Sure.
And it's interesting, and it's what makes Africa so fascinating to follow, is because it's 49 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, each one is a different story. And there are countries that are focused, they get the democracy right, but they actually don't get the governance right. There's countries that get the governance right, but they haven't quite got the democracy right. And I think too often we think of them as one and the same. And there are governments right now that think, no, I'll do the governance right. I'm going to have rule of law, but not democracy. And I think most of the panelists know who we're talking about. And there's others that, you watched what just happened in Nigeria, and I think it's a great example of what Solomon's talking about. People rose up and said, we've had enough of the corruption and the insecurity. We want a new start. Now, huge challenge to actually realize all the promise and expectations that were built up there. But it's what makes Africa so interesting right now is these are a number of young, some democracies, but others not, really struggling with how do we build this new platform.
I'll take, I have a lot to say about that democracy issue, but in the interest of getting comments from our audience here, I will take 3 more questions. I will swing around.
Take 5 for the hand.
Well, let's see how we go. I'll swing around from here and sort of bring it in. So I'll start with the young lady right here, Madame.
Thank you so much. My name is Sylvia. I'm from East Africa, specifically Uganda. I'm a Community Solutions Fellow hosted by oneblue.org in Washington, D.C. Ambassador Sezibera, my question is directed to you. East African community has shown the political will to attract investments. They've put in place the necessary infrastructure, the incentives are there. But again, on the other hand, we are sending a different signal with the political instability. Look at the developments in Burundi, look at Kenya, look at what's happening in Uganda today. Don't you think that we are somehow discouraging investors by the political divide back home?
That's one question, continuation of a theme on the governance issue. Let me take the gentleman right here, and then I'll go to the gentleman in the back.
Thank you. Maiman Nedeljkovic, President of Initiative Global Development for the last year. Before that, 25, doing agro-industry all over the continent. I want to come back, and several of the panelists spoke on this issue. For business to invest, there's 2 issues. One is infrastructure. We spoke a lot about power and other infrastructure issues. The other is size of markets. You have to scale to be competitive. Now, I have heard and have been hearing so much of the economic pacts. I think East Africa Union perhaps is a little more advanced than I've seen on ECOWAS side, but I really would like to see the African political leadership take it to real heart. It's not a matter of just expanding further into yet more economic pacts, but even the ones that are in place, let us really see product and service be able to move across. I'd like somebody to push back on that, please. Thank you.
Okay, that's 2. The gentleman in the back there, please. And don't worry, I see you. I'll come to you in a second.
Thank you. My name is Chris Heineman for Ackerman Law Firm, and I'm a young kid. I'm only like 20 years old. So basically, what I've seen from research done is with China's investment in Africa, you bring over these Chinese workers, and what Mr. Director, you said was it's that kind of exactly what Africa doesn't want, right? You want jobs, you don't want aid. And so with these jobs, you're trying to get U.S. businesses over to Africa. And my question is, how can the American people be shown that the movement of these businesses will not be like the taking away of any U.S. jobs, right? We see Ford Motor moving down to Mexico, and many people feel that, you know, it's a bad situation. I'm from Hershey, PA, right? Hershey Chocolate also moved down to Mexico. And how can it be shown that these potential jobs for the African people is not the same case?
Did we get that question?
Yeah, I got it.
Okay. All right.
I can address
You're
it.
used to that one, huh?
All right.
Oh, you want me to start that first?
We'll start there and then I'll
All right.
come. You had your question on.
Well, I think it's very interesting because we touched on it briefly earlier, but every country's got a localization and jobs package. So if you go in to sell locomotives into a country or power or oil and gas equipment, they ask for local capability because they don't want us to export something in, basically take their money and service it, but basically have no impact in the country. And that's everywhere, including here. So what happens is you, as a company, you've got to balance that. So Pennsylvania, Erie, Pennsylvania, we make locomotives. We had 5 or 6 years ago, 7 years ago, we had an order, and we built an assembly facility in South Africa for locomotives for Transnet, a company there. And yeah, we had backlash from the people in Erie, but for these 100 and 140 locomotives, but it wasn't that we were sourcing jobs, it was that we were getting 140 locomotives. And we wouldn't have it would have been zero otherwise. You either invest in South Africa or you get no order. And what we've been able to do is fundamentally keep, it's 60%, the goal is 50% local content, meaning 50% of the locomotive is made in the United States and 50% is assembled and made in South Africa. So both win. It's not so it's a zero-sum game on getting the order, and we have that in other countries as well. So it's incumbent on us to be able to work in a country, invest in a country, and be more of a holistic supplier, if you will, not just to supply the goods, but also supply jobs and training, et cetera. But at the same point in time, we have businesses here that we need to continue to manufacture and run. And that's all, but it's all part about it being a global economy. Greenville, South Carolina, we make gas turbines. In 2012, I think it was, we make 100 a year. They sell for somewhere between $20 million a piece. So they're not cheap. And not one of them was shipped to the United States. Not a one. Because there was no demand in the United States. So we need to continue an export policy, and we need to continue to have a localization policy in other areas of the world so we can balance that. And I think that's the way it has to be approached. It's not a great story necessarily for jobs that get lost, but you know, it's a global economy, and again, I say everybody wants jobs in their home in their country. And as we expand, we have to continue to look at that. And again, if we're better off getting half of a locomotive, which then led to a billion locomotive order we got 2 years ago with the help of the ambassador. And so that's how I think people have got to think about it.
Okay. Let me just go to Ambassador Sezibera to answer the question on East Africa and the mixed picture on the governance front within the East African community and the message that that's potentially sending to international partners.
Well, thanks, Sylvia. First of all, for calling yourself an East African. Then a Ugandan, I think. Now, of course, governance, I think if you look at governance across the world, it's always a mixed picture, I mean, whatever country you pick. Now, in East Africa, yes, if we don't get our governance right, then we will not get our development right. And so that conversation has to continue. In 2007, we learned from Kenya, the Kenyan experience with what happened. And therefore worked with the private sector very heavily and others to make sure that the elections in 2010, was it? Yes.
I'm trying to think, 12.
2012, yes. The elections in 2012 were peaceful and inclusive. Difficult, but it was done. The conversation is on in Uganda. We are talking to the Ugandan private sector and others to say, all right, what kind of political dispensation do you want? We didn't succeed in Burundi, although we tried. We went in last year, worked with everybody. We didn't get the results we wanted, but the conversation is on, and it's owned by the people in the country. So I think we have to get our politics right. Now it helps if outsiders keep away and let us discuss it. It does help, I can assure you. But I think it's a discussion which we as Africans need to have. Let me just briefly talk about the deepening. I think the question about deepening integration, you're absolutely right. Yeah, regional integration cannot be simply political. There is a lot of work that has to be done to make sure that goods can move across borders. Goods, people, capital. In the East African community, we have just carried out an inventory of 686 pieces of legislation or regulations that have to change to make even goods move even faster. So it's a lot of work at the political level, which is why heads of state have to be involved. I keep saying that heads of state have to be technicians. On the Northern Corridor, we have seen it. The head of state of Rwanda, of Kenya, and of Uganda meet every 2 months. And they do not meet to talk about politics. They meet to solve issues, practical issues. So that has to happen. We also have to build the capacity of the regulators, the capacity of the standards bodies, the capacity of everybody involved in making sure that integration works. That it's a lot of work that has to be done to build this one continent, but we are doing so.
Okay. Sorry, and then I'll come to you. Ambassador Gibson then.
Just add one quick point on why I think one of the sort of hidden benefits of the economic integration is it actually also induces good governance. I think it's much harder to have corruption as you build these economic communities. And one example that I know is being pursued in a number of places is, and it sort of demonstrates it perfectly, is rather than when you cross a border have to check in twice, you only have to check in once, a single border crossing. You immediately reduce the opportunities for corruption in half. It's just sort of a crystal clear example, but the whole system of integration takes out opportunities for corruption and raises the bar, and I think helps on the governance significantly.
Absolutely.
Just quickly on the jobs issue, this is a really important subject, and I think when you look at the African Growth and Opportunity Act that's been in place for 15 years, that's created about 3 million jobs directly and indirectly in Africa. And there's not one instance that our Congress has found of a U.S. worker being displaced by AGOA. And we heard from the Undersecretary of Commerce today that our trade with Africa supports some 250,000 jobs in the United States. And that's an important number in its own because it's growing. And it's also changing the dynamic of our relationship with Africa from one of the traditional donor-recipient to one of mutual benefit and mutual gain. So I think it's a relatively good story that needs to get better, and hopefully we'll get better.
I'll take one more round of questions. Actually, maybe I'll take 5 this time. Does that make you happy? We'll take 5 this time. I'll start over here and swing out this way. I will get everybody in that has their hand up right now.
Hi, my name's Jasmine Shee with Aegis Health Security, and a lot of the issues you guys being discussed here is been existing for quite some time, and I am wondering if you guys see technology being a catalyst in breaking down the cross-border issues. And then something even more fundamental is the traffic mechanism, like transportation mechanism. What astounded me when I visited there is there's no, like even railroad systems across all the countries, despite of, you know, it probably has to do with some kind of traffic regulatory systems and things like that. Anyway, I just wanted to see if technology comes into play in supporting some of the economic development, breaking down those barriers been discussed here.
Okay. John Thong in the back.
Thank you. John Thorne with the Wilson Center. Ambassador Sibera, you mentioned mental barrier as being one of the factors that impede companies from, say, investing in Africa. So how would you convince American companies to break that mental barrier? Thanks.
Okay. Gentleman right here.
My name is Gustavo Nvela, and I'm with the Voice of Democracy for the United States in Equatorial Guinea. I'm a citizen of Equatorial Guinea. I'm wondering how does it play out with regard to multinational companies who are doing business, primarily the petroleum sector, in the Republic of Equatorial Guinea, when you have clear violations of rule of law, clear violations of good governance, clear violations of political instability. How do multinationals stand by saying that they don't want to interfere with the internal affairs of a country, knowing that people like the current president of Equatorial Guinea has engaged in gross human rights violations, almost genocidal behavior with regard to some of the clans that have been wiped out? How do multinational companies justify their existence in a country like Equatorial Guinea in the 21st century?
Okay. Variation on a theme on the governance and corporate responsibility and how all of that fits into trade and investment. Take the gentleman here, and then I'll move to the back. The gentleman in the white shirt right there.
Thank you. My name is Brice Bado. I'm from Burkina Faso. I'm here as a fellow at the African program. My question is for Mr. Solomon Asamoah.
Solomon's okay. Solomon's
yeah,
okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
We are friends now.
So, could you tell us about the legal framework for trade and investment, especially why many companies, especially many multinationals, have difficulties to respect their commitment, especially with the population. For example, in Burkina Faso, we do have many mining companies, but they don't respect their commitments, and finally, their presence became sometimes a danger for us. Before they arrived, people were maybe better off, but now, since they are here, we have many difficulties. Thank you.
Another question. No need to be sorry, just trying to get in as many people. So another question on corporate responsibility in the face of bad governance and human rights issues. I'll take the two gentlemen in the back there. Yes, I see you, sir.
Thank you very much. My name is Yaya Fanusi with the United States of Africa 2017 Project Task Force. We usually try to give you information that you don't know about after we listen to you. We did a survey 10 years ago among the multi-billionaires and multi-millionaires and other people who are creating entrepreneurship in Africa, and this is what they said. The single most structural impediment for capital formation and exponential growth of capital is the political barrier division in Africa. That's why they are all supporting the creation of the federation.
Okay. All right, so another proponent for enhanced regional integration in Africa. Sir.
Hello, my name is Ryan. I'm with the Center for International Private Enterprise. I have a question. It's kind of a piggyback off of a previous question, but a little bit more specific. a lot of U.S. companies are very leery of entering the African market because of corruption and particularly the liability that they have with the FCPA, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. So how do we overcome that specific barrier of countries, of companies who might be interested in doing business in Africa, but don't want to touch it because of the liability that comes with the potential for corruption?
Yeah. And just to put some context to that, I was just looking at my figures, so thank you very much for that question. According to Transparency International's latest report, the United States is ranked 17th on the anti-corruption, on the corruption perceptions index, and you only have 5 African countries in the top 50. Botswana at 31, Cape Verde at 42, Seychelles at 43, Mauritius at 47. And the rest of the African countries populate the bottom of, mostly the bottom of the scale. So that's a real issue. That's a real issue. So I just wanted to provide that context as we deal with this. So I will swing around this way. I'll start with you, Whitney. But while I do that, I'm going to, as we look towards summing up here, I'm going to ask our panelists to think about a 2-minute closing remarks. And what I'd like you to do is, for my American colleagues sitting on that end, since we're here talking about some of the things that we need to do, we've acknowledged some of the progress that has been made, but we're also here to talk about some concrete and practical actions that we can take on both the African side and the US side to advance U.S.-Africa relations in terms of trade and investment and sustainable development. If you had the opportunity to advise President Obama right now and say, from a U.S. perspective, here are 2 actions that I think the United States could take to see even more progress in this area, what would those 2 recommendations be? That's for the U.S. side. But I also want you to give us one recommendation for our African colleagues. So if there's one thing that African governments could change that would really make a difference in terms of advancing U.S.-Africa economic trade and investment relations, what would that thing be? And similarly for African colleagues. So if you were to talk to President Obama and say, these are the 2 things that we really wish the U.S. would do to really facilitate and advance, what would those things be? And a little bit of introspection, the one thing that you think Africa needs to change, or African countries really need to change, work on. We know corruption has come up a number of times. We know that the issue of governance has come up a number of times, but if there's one thing that you would put that requires change, that would make a difference, really amplify the opportunity, what would that one thing be? So I'll have you think about that. But
is Jay on the U.S. side? Or?
Yes, he's on the U.S. side. You can claim him after this, but for now he's on the U.S. side. So let me just swing this way, and then on the recommendations, I'll go that way.
Okay,
Yeah.
so we just respond to the question.
Respond to the questions first.
Okay, I'm just going to...
And 2 minutes to the question,
yeah,
so
sure.
pick a couple.
I'm just going to pick one.
Okay.
And for me, it's the hardest one, and it's a question about Equatorial Guinea. Because it's Equatorial Guinea, but it's not just Equatorial Guinea. There are a number of governments in Africa who have dismal human rights records, who have dismal rule of law records, where there are U.S. companies, where there are international companies, and largely it's in the extractive sector. You know, we saw this in South Africa during the apartheid era. Do you stay or do you leave? And there's a whole host of companies that said, we're going to stay and we're going to invest and we're going to try and make it better. A lot of people disagreed with that, but out of that grew the corporate social responsibility dynamic as we know it. In Equatorial Guinea, and it's something I know well, you know, I see companies doing a couple things. You've got a company like Marathon that's there, that's working to eradicate malaria on Bioko Island. You've got a company like Hess that's involved in a $50 million education program that first, phase one, educated teachers and now is educating students. You've got those companies collectively working to pressure the government to conform to the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, EITI. If those companies weren't there, none of that would happen. And other companies from other countries would come in and extract the oil. So it's an extremely difficult issue. It's a very emotional issue. But I come down on the side, it's better to have companies there trying to do the right things in the way, in their space where they can do the right things than not.
Absolutely, I do support the oil companies and what they're doing for the record. And I hope that the Equatorial Guinea this year will allow itself to be fully embracing the EITI because they were kicked out.
Okay.
Right.
Excuse me, sir. We understand, and this is an issue that all of us feel very strongly and passionately about, but please give the panelists an opportunity to engage, to respond. You will have an opportunity to talk to them afterwards, but we want to make sure that everybody who asks the question has an opportunity to get a response. So thank you. You want to continue, Whitney? Are you done?
No, so just parting thought, it's not just about investing in Africa, it's about investing in Africans. And it's about investing in the community. And I think that's what American companies have a really good track record in doing.
Okay, questions? I'll take the corruption one. I think two things. One is corruption's a two-way street. Somebody may ask for something, you don't have to give it.
Right.
So I think it's incumbent on any company, whether it's an American company or anywhere, that they have strong ethics, strong integrity policies, continually training their own people in doing that. You know, that's what we do. Do we have issues that now and then because somebody does something wrong in a company of 300,000 people? We do. But I think it's an aspect of leadership and it's an aspect of making sure that people know that there's nothing worth, there's no order or no deal worth some of the, you know, a corrupt issue or an FCPA issue. You know, I think, and to the point, corruption's everywhere. I mean, who knows what the story is, but you just saw a major CEO step down yesterday. So, you know, and I think that when people think about that, they highlight Africa. Now, I'm not saying it isn't there, because it is, but you've got to make sure that people understand that. And it's hard for a smaller company to say no. I agree with that. So and that's where I think other companies can come across and help. But I think it's something that it shouldn't deter you from investing. It may deter you from doing a specific deal, but on the whole, you're going to, as a company, you'll miss out on this tremendous opportunity of growth. And then I think, the technology, agreed. Any technology that helps on whether it's importation in the ports, customs, all that is a governance thing. It eliminates corruption. Any time that U.S., or not U.S., but people's hands don't touch the deal, it's one less aspect of a potential for corruption. As far as my summary, from an American perspective, we need focus. And we need focus. I would say that what the government can do, there are too many, I said it earlier, the fragmentation. And what happens is you get a good idea, you go to work on it, and you go to one group. They can't do it because it's not in their charter, but another group may be able to do it, and so nothing gets done. So I think that's one thing. If they could put all of that under and talk about Africa and what's needed from a U.S. government agency perspective and kind of coordinate, that would be great. And number two, on the African side, the African governments and all don't have to learn the hard way. There's nothing that hasn't been learned somewhere else that can't be taught. So let's get some best practice sharing around whether it's governance, whether it's oil policy, whether it's how you do customs or whatever. There's a lot of knowledge out there that can help these countries. As Don said, they're relatively new. A lot of them, and trying to work through the policies, the regulatory aspects, and then the execution of those. And we've all been, countries have all been through it, so there's a lot of lessons learned, and they don't have to learn the hard way.
Thank you. Sure, come this one.
So, Jay and Whitney both stole a couple things I was going to say, but one of the most, come back to the technology point, as Whitney mentioned, a bunch of us were in Kenya at the Youth Entrepreneurship Summit, or the Entrepreneurship Summit. But what blew me away was the creative ideas around the table. Solomon mentioned, and Copa was there, but there were, 200, every person I talked to, I saw this great new idea to create a business that at the same time was solving a social problem. The power of it was really remarkable, and it's, we were in Nairobi, but it's happening in South Africa, it's happening in Ghana, it's happening in Nigeria, it's happening in Dakar. It's the most exciting part of what's going on the continent, is this incredible resurgence. I actually call it the re-aspera too, because I think a lot of Africans who've gone to the U.S. are now coming back. They see this economic opportunity, and they're coming back to be a part of it. And their job prospects, honestly, are quite often much better in Africa than they are in Europe or the U.S., because that's where the growth is. So I think it's a very exciting time. It's very powerful, and I think it's something that, I give the Obama administration credit for figuring that out, investing, whether it's through YALI or the Entrepreneurship Summit, in the young people of Africa, in realizing that's where the future is. And if I had recommendations to give, it would be to do more and make it more African. So instead of just bringing young African leaders here, invest in those organizations that are building out the capabilities on the continent, because that's where the power is going to be. I mean, we only need to look at what's going on in Europe right now with the refugee crisis, and the numbers are tiny compared to what they'll be if we don't get this right in Africa, working with African countries. And I think the flip side of what Mande said, or asked about, what would I advise the Africans? Luckily, the ambassador here is doing the hard work. I think getting this integration done quickly and in a focused fashion, and not having it be lip service, is the fastest way to create economic growth and job creation. And the second piece is what Solomon's doing, which is getting that infrastructure built that allows that trade to happen, allows the power and the water and the schools to be built.
Okay. Ambassador Sesebera,
I'll
give you 2 minutes if that's okay.
Your question, mental barriers for how to break the mental barriers for U.S. companies to invest in Africa, in East Africa. The best way to do it, I think, is to get the business people to talk. And we are doing that through the U.S. EAC Commercial Dialogue. We have an umbrella organization of East African businesses called the East African Business Council. And they are working with their colleagues at the Corporate Council on Africa, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, to keep the dialogue and get together. They will meet again next year, early next year. So this is what we need to do. Let me make a quick comment on corruption, to say that I agree fully that industry in Africa also needs to get involved in the fight against corruption. In East Africa, this year in November, the East African Business Council and its members will sign a code of conduct around corruption, and all the major companies are involved. What we are trying to do is stop the race to the bottom and get them to really commit to a good industry-led, industry-developed, industry-monitored code of conduct on corruption. Ideas, and then on corruption also, though, I happen to think that the more we move away from commodities and extractive industries and get into industrialization and trade in manufactured products, the more difficult it will be for corruption to thrive. This is the lesson from the West, from the US, from everywhere. So investing in Africa's industrialization is also partly a fight against corruption and promotion of good governance. For African leaders, I would say infrastructure, continued investments in infrastructure is critical, including energy, as well as regional integration. I mean, now it doesn't make sense. It's so difficult for Africans to move on the African continent that it just does not make any sense at all. And therefore, we need to remove all these barriers that we place before Africans to move and work on their own continent. Then we'll make sure that outsiders can also move more easily. I think that's what we need to do. For the US, the same thing. I am surprised, I keep getting surprised that the United States is not involved in infrastructure on the continent, and I don't understand it. So if President Obama can manage to mobilize US companies to come, listen, people can wait for the Chinese to build Africa's roads and then you trade on them. Or you can be part of the infrastructure development for Africa and then use that to eventually trade. And the next one is skilling, getting involved in skilling Africa. Again, US institutions of higher learning, if the president can get them together to contribute to the skilling of Africa, then I think it will be a good investment for our continent.
All right. Solomon, last but not least.
Okay, I'll be
2 minutes,
quick.
my brother.
All right.
Okay.
Let me touch firstly on, as the person responsible for regional integration in Africa Development Bank, let me talk upon that. The issues of regional integration, I think we have to focus on those barriers that stop regional integration from happening. And some of them is related to hard infrastructure. I have 2 slides that I put up. One is of this very bad road with cars that can't move or trucks that can't move, and there's a big traffic jam behind it. And you can easily see that the infrastructure is slowing down the movement of goods and services. Second picture I put up is of a 5-lane highway going into a country that's completely empty, and you have a line of lorries going back 3 miles waiting at the border to go across. That is not an infrastructure problem. That is a policy and a corruption problem at the border. So there's hard infrastructure that we have to address, but there's also these policies and these barriers that can be solved with pieces of paper and enforced by the government. So I think we have to look at both. I just want to finally just touch quickly on the corruption issue, because one of the things I'm happy about is that we talk about it more in open forums, even with ministers present and things of that nature, which I think is definitely a move forward. I have a very simple approach to corruption. We have to increase the cost that you will pay if you get caught doing corruption. Where people do it without any regard is that they feel like they won't get caught, and if they get caught, they can bribe their way out of it with the money that they've got illicitly. I think if we can make the cost so high, then it will act as a deterrent and will curb human behavior. I don't think people are any more, any less corrupt in Africa. It's just that they can get away with it more. So I think we need to change that balance, and I think then we'll see some changes. If I had all of the African governments here and I had to give them one piece of advice that I would say, and I touched upon it earlier, well, 2 actually, if I can have 2. First one.
I thought he got 2 and 1.
Be consistent. Be consistent. You don't have to be perfect, but if people know these are the rules of the games and they're not going to change, it goes a long way. And the second thing is, I would like, if I could wave a magic wand, reform the civil service, the bureaucracies in the governments, because that's where most of the problems, most of the good feelings end. When an investor comes across in traffic, all excited, and then has to deal with the civil service or the government bureaucracy and ask for bribes, and that's when their enthusiasm goes. I think those are the 2 things I would say.
And just beyond the bribing, I mean, we know of companies that are trying to do business in Africa and just in some African countries, and even just getting a response can take months. And so that's a problem that we have. Whitney, I'll give you the last word, and then I'll have to conclude since we're behind, so I'll stand up here and watch you.
So just briefly with recommendations. So if President Obama was right here, I make two recommendations, as you suggest. One is really to establish a position in the White House where there's not a czar, but a very efficient coordinator to pull all U.S. government agencies together, get them working together to promote U.S. business in Africa, because there are many agencies doing many things, and we're not speaking as Team USA. That's one. Second would be to find budget items for the next 20 years to fund the Young Africa Leaders Initiative. There's no question in my mind that this program will be the great legacy of this administration. In the last 2 years, there have been 1,000 Yali Fellows here in the United States. 80,000 young Africans have applied for these positions. And to an individual, they're some of the most impressive people that you've ever met. They are the future leaders. They are our future partners. They're trained at our universities here, and that's what's going to change the picture between the U.S. and Africa. My last point really takes up on Solomon's point, goes to the dichotomy between democracy and governance. And it would be to African governments to double down on the governance issue, to double down on the efficiency of civil servants, to really make that a priority, make that be seen as something, as a career that can really deliver the future for the country right now.
Right. Thank you so much to all of you, truly. I think just in a quick summary, it is good that we launched this Brown Capital Africa Forum with a look back at this historic U.S. Africa Leaders Summit, because it really helps us to see where we are as far as U.S. Africa economic engagement, but also, and this is something I'm appreciative to each of you individually, talked about the progress that we have made, but you have also shown that we haven't even begun to scratch the surface as far as the potential for this relationship to go is concerned. And so you've made some really concrete recommendations of key issues that we need to address. You've been very frank and candid in offering those recommendations for both the US and the African side. And you have really set a wonderful foundation as to the issues that we will be discussing over the next 5 years through this Brown Capital Africa Forum. And I thank you. The purpose of the forum, just to remind you again, is to really bring Africans and Americans, policymakers, practitioners, and subject matter experts together to figure out how we can further this relationship in a way that is meaningful and impactful for both Africa and for the United States. And all of you raised some really, really important issues that we will be addressing through the forum over the next 5 years, digging really deeply and continuing this trend of offering practical recommendations that we can pass on to policymakers, that we can share with practitioners so that they can implement. Some of the issues that we will be dealing with, addressing through the forum, include looking at long-term sustainable development in Africa and the role of sovereign wealth funds, looking at U.S. Africa trade and investment, key challenges and opportunities, amplifying U.S. trade and investment by addressing key barriers and mitigating risk, doing business in Africa, addressing the corruption factor, comparing U.S. and Chinese business models in Africa and what are the implications for human security and sustainable development, and linking trade and investment to the Sustainable Development Goals, which have just been approved, the post-2015 Millennium Development Goals, and really facilitating intra-regional integration and intra-regional trade in Africa. What do we need to do to facilitate that? And so I thank you for raising these issues. They came up very strongly, very clearly, and very loudly in your presentation. I thank all of you for coming. And what I'm hoping that you have seen here today is the sort of issues that we're going to be addressing and how important they are. Your participation obviously is critical. We're going to take a narrow slice of each of these issues over the course of the next 5 years and really dig deep, not just sort of the surface. Today we're identifying issues and talking about some of these issues, but over the next 5 years we hope to dig deeply into these issues, and we're relying on you and counting on you, given your commitment to Africa and to U.S. Africa relations, to join us for that dialogue. And it really has to be a dialogue. It can't be a one-way street of the U.S. saying this is what we need, Africans saying this is what the U.S. should do. So we're going to continue this tradition of bringing Americans and Africans together, engaging the diaspora here to work with us. let me just say some really quick thank yous. First of all, please join me in thanking our panelists. And please join me in thanking Mr. and Mrs. Brown and the Brown Capital team. As many of you know, I am deeply passionate about Africa and U.S. Africa relations, and the Browns and Brown Capital Management have really been supportive of the mission that we have here to work on these economic issues and sustainable development issues in Africa. And on a personal level, on a professional level, I cannot thank you enough, so thank you so much. There's one other person that I neglected to thank early on, and that would be Gary Officer. This would not have been possible without him. I mean, he was really instrumental in connecting me with the Browns and working with me through this. So Gary, thank you so much, and I appreciate your presence here. And then, but to you, all of you, please, I hope to see you here. It is important. It can't be just us U.S. government officials talking amongst ourselves. Your contributions are absolutely key. The next event will be in December, and we will send you an invitation to that as well. We will also send you the paper that Whitney did on an overview and assessment of how well we've delivered on the commitments from last year. So expect to get that from us tomorrow. So thank you very much, Whitney. And then finally, to the wonderful Africa program team. You guys are absolutely fantastic, and the Wilson Center team. And with that, the program continues. We would like to invite all of you to a reception that we're going to have just across the way here. Our team will usher you there, and you can continue to dialogue with the speakers. My brother from Equatorial Guinea, an opportunity to engage. It's a key issue, absolutely. So go for it. And so we invite you to join us for the reception. In the meantime, I'd like to ask the Brown Capital team and our speakers to just stay here for a second, and then we'll be with you. So we're going to do a quick photo.